I think that also today, if we see our textiles, we can see a lot of made in China brands, made in Bangladesh. But I'm also interested in a fairly new phenomenon that is bringing these terrible production conditions, cheap labor, back into the Western part. For instance, certain diasporas from China, from Bangladesh, are actually making factories within the States and Europe and actually really exploiting their labors. I mean, it's almost slave-like working condition. I have a lot of curiosities, but I would like to give floor to you first. And if there is no, I mean, I'm sure it's going to be a lot of questions. Please answer.
Yeah. I have a very contemporary question. Very contemporary question, and I hope you could help me answer it. When we talk about fast fashion or how it, what an impact it has on people's lives, could we change the conditions in which these people work by our individual choices that we make as consumers, or are there systematic changes to be made?
That's a very good question. Well, of course, if our individual choices would all lead to, a similar choice pattern, and but I doubt that is. I mean, that's very hard to organize, and it needs to be organized. That's in the first place. So I believe, and that you also see, for instance, in discussions on buying cheap meat. Consumers also in the West, and with the increasing divergence in very rich and quite poor households in the West as well, tend to think of economizing on consumer goods as a very important strategy. So I'm not sure if it's without any regulations or organization from within society or from the government, I don't see it happening, I think. Yeah, maybe I'm too pessimistic, but...
Yes, thank you very much, Elise, for this very rich overview. And I have many questions and many comments, but maybe here I would like you to problematize a little bit about this cheap labor argument that I see has a long history. Clean Clothes Campaign I recently read a Clean Clothes Campaign research on the price of the Bangladesh t-shirt. If you look at the price of the Bangladesh t-shirt, you see that 1% goes to the labor and almost 50% go to the marketing. So how is this cheap labor argument linked to, also taking into account of what you said about international agreements, local and national protection of industry, political decisions about giving maybe better payment to local, national industrial workers, or like not doing that, and so not to look at this as a natural thing. Of course, cheap labor is over there, just move our production to something.
You mean to look at other
if you historically
stages in the product chain, you mean, or what?
No, if you see that as a political decision, is that a political decision? I mean, why? To problematize a little bit, because we talk about, it seems as a natural thing. Of course, labor is cheaper over there, but it's not natural. I mean, because so much money is put into marketing in the contemporary times, because the marketing is the most important. But maybe previous experiences tell us that money was put into export or other kind of
Okay.
organization. And in the contemporary times, I know that people talk about the importance to see the industrialization in the global north as part of like a political dislocation and disorganization of industrial labor force that played a very important role in the second half of the 20th century. So if you look at within this context.
So you mean if you look in earlier times also?
Yes.
Well,
historical.
Yeah. It's all to it. Well, not always, but it's been political, way back in history. I think when, for instance, in the 17th, 18th century, the city merchants wanting to put out yarn in the countryside, there was also heavy protest. But still, it went on because they had a majority in the Estate General, so it was decided in favor of this, for instance. So, yeah, it's been political for ages, you could say. And I wouldn't say that it is natural. Also, not the fact that women are always paid less than men, or usually paid less than men. What I've tried to do in my earlier work is also show how arguments of productivity, for instance, like men are more productive than women, and that's why to sort of tackle those by also looking at how maybe labor markets are also on purpose segmented in order to, keep wages down in some sectors. So not providing women alternatives in the labor market leads to a crowding into, for instance, in this period, spinning, but later in maybe in other professions, and drives down wages on purpose because, there's political stakes at keeping those wages down. In this place, at a local level, at a national level, and at a global level. And I don't want to say it's natural at all, but pointing to these processes and also pointing to their longevity in the mechanisms, I think is important for also, fighting the idea that it's now, in the present day, natural, I would say. Yeah. I hope that it somehow answered your question.
I have a few questions. One is overall, because, first of all, thanks for a fascinating, sort of very long history overview. But it struck to me that, your overview was about textile and not so much about clothing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that the two should not really be mixed.
No, that's true.
The story would be very different for clothing as opposed to textile, whereas you seem to mix, like, some figures were for both clothing and textiles, some comments and pictures. So I couldn't understand what you're focusing on, because I think really one must make a distinction if one holds with respect to the sexual issue.
Yeah.
Right? And that's very important.
Yeah, that's a fair point, yeah.
Right. The second point is just a curiosity, the two must be. And that is, how much is China's competition, as opposed to the Benetton or whatever multinational, keeping conditions of low wages, etc., in other developing countries? Because it seems to me that even more than the action of multinational, it is China that is now the player on the scene as far as low cost is concerned. So, does it have an indirect impact on the, emerging countries or whatever, low competition countries? And the third is that I would be a little bit careful about just emphasizing the conditions of exploitation for women in these countries. Of course, we know they're terrible. But the problem is, if you go to this country, or if you look at something, this. You ask yourself, but women, I mean, I'm asking her, it's a genuine question. Women in a textile factory, even in Bangladesh, are they really worse off than most of the men who sell rubbish on the street or little things on the street? So, it's true, there are conditions of exploitation, but like in the West, isn't it a bad, if you want, but a road to the emancipation, the economic emancipation of some women in this country?
Yeah. Thank you very much. All very, very fair points. First of all, textiles versus clothing. I think most of my story was about, the spinning and weaving of textiles. I know a bit about clothing, also in the earlier period, with the tailors and the seamstresses as well. There's, though, quite distinct differences between male and female cloth makers there as well, clothing makers there as well. It gets a bit more complicated towards really the end of the period, where, I talk about the Global South, and I agree, and I mix it there a bit. Because a lot of what is going on in Bangladesh, for instance, is indeed clothing, and it's these ateliers, with the bad working conditions. That is totally true. Of course, my expertise is not, this is not to excuse myself, but my expertise is further back in time. So, and I know that I'm doing this, but it's good of you to point out. About China's competition, yes, I think it's not only, though, a present-day phenomenon, but it's the threat, the global threat of, I say threat, of China as a massive exporter of first spun and woven cotton cloth was already decisive for conditions in other countries from the 1960s onwards. Because that is exactly what the multi-fiber agreement did, because they prohibited or they put a lot of tariffs on Chinese imports. Multinationals started going to countries that were exempt to get even more competitive prices. So I think yes, and it's now, of course, since Deng Xiaoping, China has moved into the communist capitalist, and it becomes a more it becomes a more dominant player, also being themselves investors of capital, of course, in other parts of the world, and going to get raw materials there under exploitative conditions like in Africa, which has also been called like neo-colonialism. So yeah, I agree. We shouldn't only look at the dichotomy global north, global south in these power relations. I very much agree. And thank you also for the warning of being over emphasizing exploitation. This is always a bit difficult because I do think, and I said that in my final words, like, of course, it's better to have a job and a relatively stable one in a textile factory than to be unemployed. And I do think, and that's also, in our lecture, I go into it in a bit different way, and I emphasize the agency that even working in textile production also gives, like Bangladeshi girls or sex workers as well, domestic workers as well. So I agree with you. And I also agree that it provides women and girls some agency within their families with the economic contribution they make. Yeah, I totally agree.
May I have one question that refers also to your period? I wonder what was the union movement in the colonies, especially in Java that you were researching. I'm actually observing nowadays workers, and I see a lot of fatigue among the workers.
Yeah.
I have to be frank. So they're
Where?
just like,
I mean, where
in Slovenia.
Okay.
It's just okay, I have a job. It's all often like that. And I'm wondering, therefore, if workers in the colonies were organized in any ways.
No, because all the Dutch prohibited all organizations because they were afraid, especially in the beginning of the 20th century, of nationalist movement, political movement. So the only movements allowed were welfare and, you know, Islamic schooling, and they kept that on a very tight watch as well, because they were also afraid of Islam leading to nationalism, and that of course happened ultimately, but unions were definitely not allowed. Yeah. And although like women's organizations did emerge in the late colonial period, and that was also more political, I think, and not as much focused on labor conditions. And I think after independence, I'm not sure, it's not my expertise, but I would guess that Sukarno did not really like, even though he was a communist, he did not really like labor unions. But I don't know about the post-colonial period. Yeah.
Thank you. One more question, because we are still in. Okay.
I had two questions, but you just preceded me that I wanted to ask about the role of the unions, of course, because there are after First World War, but before also, at the end of 19th century and so on, just that you are adopting the longue durée, of course, trade unions always, the West Side, of course, they did a lot to help workers and to organize workers. And you didn't mention, or maybe I lost something, about children involved in this activity in the textile, because I think it's a third typology of exploitation of people that maybe we have to take into consideration, of course.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, about the trade unions, yes, for sure, they became important in the late 19th, early 20th century. We, in our volume on textile workers, we paid a lot of attention to that, and actually, generally, compared to trade unions in other sectors, the textile trade unions were relatively compliant, and that has been attributed to the high share of women in the industry and their lesser, you know, inclination towards labor militancy. But it's also a bit of a stereotype. But I do believe textile trade unions in general, compared to other trade unions, were less effective than some other, like the metal or the even the diamond cutters, etc., etc. So it's not my focus per se, but if you want to know more about it, we in that volume.
My interest was if you took into consideration this question.
Yeah.
Because you spoke about education also of women.
Yeah.
And so usually it's connected to the representation and to the trade unions.
Yes, certainly. And of course the trade unions were also, more in general, sometimes opposed to a lot of women working in factories, and they wanted to, because they wanted to fight for this male breadwinner wage, etc. So this also contrasts a bit with industries that had a lot of women in them. With regard to children, yes, I actually also wrote things about child labor, and I do believe that age is another, you know, apart from gender and race, another category that is not always taken into account in this labor exploitation. And there is also a thing like, for very long, child labor has been framed as like a rite de passage, you know, a learning process for both, and that also sustains sometimes gender divisions of labor at later ages. So I think it's very important, and I know some things about it, but it was hard to also take that into this.
Because we have now two perspectives. If we look to Asia, to other countries, there the accept the concept that children can
Yeah.
work, here not. So I think...
But that was very different until the early 20th
Yes, yes,
century.
I mean,
Yeah.
they can accept, they can afford.
yes, this is... Yes.
We can afford not accept.
Exactly.
They can't.
And
That's
it's
the
been
problem.
even used in ILO meetings in the 1970s when, you know, in the context of global increasing competition from Asia, the Western parties said, like, you should abandon child labor. And it was even used by India and China saying, well, now it's our turn to industrialize and to use our cheap sources of labor to become richer. So, yeah,
Well,
like the climate discussion.
Sorry, if I may say, because that is, if I may interject. There was, as you know, a big debate on that in India until someone, an economist was named Basu,
Yeah, Basu.
Koch, intervened. He's from the left, I mean, he's one who studied with Amartya Sen, etc., and he said, he just pointed out something very commonsensical, meaning that a lot of families rely on the earnings of children. Otherwise, you send them straight into poverty. So at least have a transition period or something. I mean, you can't simply say, you know, children should not, full stop. There is an economic reason.
Until you have, you know, a good alternative. Yeah,
Yeah,
and I think
exactly.
he also pointed out that it was actually not only the very lowest families that put their children out to work, but exactly the ones just above
just
that.
rising, the second layer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
water.
Okay. I think we're out of time.
Yes, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation.